Don't let a DUI charge ruin your life. Get a professional and confidential evaluation from our experienced team at True Heights Treatment. Our evaluations are accepted by the majority of courts in the state of Illinois and provide a comprehensive assessment of your substance use patterns and potential treatment needs. Get the help you need today and start your path to a brighter future. Contact us now to schedule your evaluation at 708-248-7039 or at thtdui.com.
The George Brassey podcast is made possible with funding provided from Brassey Global Strategies, LLC, a leading political consulting, public policy, government affairs, and research firm. Are you interested in running for elected office? Need advice? Call or email George, 708-769-5015. Brassey Global Strategies 1 at gmail.com.
It's my pleasure to welcome Pastor Matt Dubensky from St. Paul Lutheran Church in Chicago Heights to the podcast. Pastor Matt, thanks for coming on.
Hey, not a problem. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Pastor Matt, tell the audience a little bit about who you are.
Sure. My name is Matt Dubensky. I'm the pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church here in Chicago Heights. Originally, I'm from Michigan, actually. I grew up in Jackson, Michigan. And my wife and I, so I'm married. My wife and I have been married for 2.5 years. I met her in St. Louis. So I was down in St. Louis, which is like, just kind of grad school for pastors. So while in seminary, she and I met and got married October 2019. I'm a young guy. I'm only 28 years old. So yeah, I'm the pastor here at St. Paul's, and this is my first assignment as a pastor. So I've been here at St. Paul's for about a year now. So like in a couple of weeks, it'll be 1 year. But yeah, this is my first church, and my wife and I are just still getting to learn the area, and we love it here. We're having a good time.
Pastor Matt, what inspires you initially to become a pastor?
It's a great question. I think I've heard that question a lot, and it's interesting because at least in my circle, in the Lutheran world, a lot of guys become pastors, and it's kind of almost like a family trade. I tell people I'm a pastor, and one of the first questions I get is, "Oh, so your dad's a pastor too?" It's like, "Oh, actually, no, first pastor in the family." So my journey into becoming a minister is a little bit different than the norm. So growing up, I didn't want to be a pastor. I really wanted to be a teacher, but I had a heart for theology and the church. I've always had a heart for the church. I grew up in church. My parents took me every week, and I'm very grateful for that. I was always very active at my congregation growing up, but I just had my heart and mind set on being a teacher. But many times I had people that would say to me, "Oh, Matt, you should consider becoming a pastor." And I always kind of shrugged that off and said, "No, that's not for me." But you hear that enough times, and I started to sit there and think to myself, maybe I ought to pray about this and actually consider it for 5 seconds. And just over time, the Lord, I guess, worked on my heart. And in the end, I think I was about 17, 18 years old, and I had pretty much made up my mind. Okay, I'm going to go to seminary after my bachelor's degree. So that was kind of it. In particular, though, I think there was an individual, I'd like to say a certain person that kind of pushed me the most into the ministry. Not my parents, not my grandma, although they were big influences. One of the people that really pushed me most was this little old lady at my home church in Jackson. Her name was Frida Blackwood. She just died a couple of years back. So Frida, she lived to be she was either 102 or 103. And every time I volunteered growing up, I would volunteer and help out at church. I'd light the candles, or I'd even get up and do the readings. And whenever I helped out, Frida would pull me aside after church, and she'd always say, "I always love seeing you up front. Have you thought about being a pastor?" And she kept asking me that all the time. And she had a strong impact for me in my decision to even consider pastoral ministry. And it's funny because thinking back, I really think that she just liked me because, I'm a loud guy. I have a loud speaking voice. And so I think she could just hear me really well. So that's why she wanted me up front. But either way, she had quite the impact on me.
Pastor Matt, where do you go to college and what do you study in your bachelor's?
Yeah. So I went to Concordia University in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Concordia is the name of like a college system. So we had 10 colleges. I think a couple have closed. I think we have 8 still. So there's one in up in Mequon, Wisconsin, not too far from here. There's one in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and a few others around the country. So I went to Concordia and I studied like pre-seminary studies. I studied theology. I basically majored in biblical Hebrew and Greek. So part of the requirements for becoming a pastor in the Lutheran Church is you have to know the original languages that the Bible was written in. And so I got my bachelor's degree essentially in I guess biblical languages. So I had a love for Hebrew. It was a lot of fun.
And then what is that journey like from completing your bachelor's degree to making the decision to go to the seminary?
So it's really interesting. To go to seminary, you don't need any particular degree, like any focus. You just have to have a bachelor's degree. So some guys, get a degree in education or business or finance and, unrelated to ministry, and then they decide to go to seminary. So for me, it was kind of a lateral move because I was already kind of studying theology. But so I finished my bachelor's, and then I just had, during my senior year, I applied at the seminary and I got in. And so then I just had to move down to St. Louis, and then that got my master's in divinity. And unlike, most master's degrees are like a 2 or a 3-year program. For a master's of divinity with a seminary, that was a 4-year degree. So all in all, I did 8 years of college. And then at the end, they send you out. So I'm not sure what it's like in other traditions, other faith traditions. I think it's a little different. But for us in the Lutheran Church, it was at the end of the 4 years, they had a big service and they started reading off names. Okay, here's where you're going. Here's where you're going. And my wife and I, we could have ended up anywhere in the United States. We had no idea. It's kind of a surprise. And so then we found out, last year in April, all right, you're going to South Chicago. And here we are.
Pastor Matt, can you talk a little bit about the history of the Lutheran Church?
Sure, absolutely. So that word Lutheran comes from the guy Martin Luther. So we all know Martin Luther King Jr., but this is a different Martin Luther a long time ago. Martin Luther, the German, he originally was a Catholic priest. So to talk about the history of the Lutheran Church, we kind of got to go back about 500 years. So back in the 15th and 16th century, the Catholic Church was getting into a lot of, I guess I'll call it questionable practices, especially in Europe. There was a big thing going around where the Catholic Church was charging people indulgences. And what an indulgence was basically the church would come to you and say, hey, you know what? You probably don't want your grandma to have to wait another 1,000 years to get into heaven, right? So if you just pay us some money, we'll give you this certificate and we'll cut 500 years off of purgatory and she'll get to heaven sooner. It was honestly kind of this like emotional con artist work. And the church at the time was really milking people for more money. And this practice had developed, kind of slowly. But at that time, there was this Catholic priest, Martin Luther. He was actually a monk. And as he read the Bible for himself, he realized, wow, this thing where, the church is basically charging people to get to heaven. This thing where, to be a Christian, to be a Catholic, you have to pay all this money. He's like, man, that doesn't sound right. That's not what the Bible's telling me. The Bible says, hey, salvation is the free gift of God. That's the big word there. It's free. So the Bible doesn't say you need to pay money to get to heaven. And so as Martin Luther read the Bible, he realized that there was a lot of stuff going on in the church that kind of didn't match what the Bible taught. So he put together this list. I guess I can call it a list of grievances, but it was called the 95 Theses. So basically the 95 things that he realized where the church didn't line up with what the Bible said. And so he wrote this big list, and back in the day, there's no Facebook or no vlogging or blogging, so he writes out this list of 95 theses by hand, and he actually nails it to the church door of this big Catholic church in Wittenberg, Germany. And this was kind of just like putting up a billboard back then. And so this kind of sparked this revolution. If you've heard of the Protestant Reformation, many people point to this as kind of the beginning of it. It was a time where the Christians were able finally to kind of get the Bible translated into their own language. They could read it for themselves and started to ask themselves, hey, what should the church be? And where does it and where does it not line up with Scripture? So in many ways, Martin Luther and his actions, that was the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. And, the Catholic, so he was still Catholic at this point, but the Catholic Church, they didn't really like what he had to say. How dare he complain about what we're doing? Of course, they wanted to keep collecting all the extra money, right? So and instead of going along with it and kind of reforming their practices, instead they're like, well, let's just get rid of this Martin Luther guy, and that'll solve the problem. So they wanted to get him arrested and killed. It was honestly like the mob was out to get him. It was just kind of the powerhouse of the Catholics. They were coming after him. So in the end, though, they didn't kill him. They kicked him out of the Catholic Church. They excommunicated him. But at this point, he wasn't really interested in worshiping with the Catholics anymore. He didn't want to be a Catholic priest anymore because he didn't like what they were teaching. So he basically just started his own church. The Catholics started, they were like, okay, see you later, and they just said, okay, bye. But the group of people that kind of went with Luther, that followed him out to, kind of start their own church, the Catholics basically tried to shame them, and they labeled them Lutherans. And Martin Luther and his group just kind of wore that title with pride and said, all right, fine. You're going to call us this to kind of, I don't know, not make fun of us, but maybe shame us. But you know what? That's fine. We'll call ourselves Lutherans. And that was the beginning of the Lutheran Church, which we basically call that beginning like 1517, which is when he posted those theses. So that was when the Lutheran Church really began, was 1517 over in Germany. Fast forward a couple hundred years, and in the 1800s, the Lutheran Church is still going strong, especially in Germany. But there was a lot of religious persecution, and there was a lot of issues with the government trying to step in and control the churches and kind of what they taught. And so a lot of these German Lutherans decided to flee Germany and come to America here in the US, where they would have the freedom to worship without kind of the government being able to step in and tell them what to teach. And so at that point in the 1800s, as many of these Lutherans came over and started churches here in the United States, that was the beginning of the Lutheran Church in America. And that church body here in the U.S. were known as the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and so that's the church body that I'm part of today, and that's the LCMS. That's what St. Paul's is a part of. We're part of that Lutheran group.
And now that group, it can tie itself back all the way to Luther. After Luther dies, does he have a succession plan for the church in place?
That is a good question. I'm not too sure about that. I don't remember who exactly followed Luther in, kind of in his footsteps, but I do know that there was kind of an explosion of churches following the Reformation. See, when that Reformation happened, it wasn't just, well, you got the Catholics and now you got the Lutherans. There's two different churches now. It wasn't just that. There was other people that also broke off. You got Zwingli and Calvin and these other groups. You've got Calvinists and Reformed churches and even the Baptist church. So a lot of these other Protestant faith traditions have their history tied back all the way back to the years closely following 1517. So 1517 to like 1600, there was all of these churches that kind of began that we still have today. Churches all over America kind of tie their history back to that time period. And so it wasn't just Luther led this exodus and everybody followed him or stayed Catholic. There was actually like over and over again, groups were splitting off and they were disagreeing about, oh, we think the Bible says this, we think it teaches this. And so there was a lot of just a crazy hodgepodge of different denominations kind of sprouting up all over the place. It took things a little while to kind of settle down.
What do you think are the big differences between the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church as a whole?
As a whole, I would say today, and the Catholic Church, they've also kind of reformed themselves quite a bit, since those 500 years ago. But I would say today, Catholics and Lutherans are very, very similar. There are a couple distinct differences. One of them is that the Catholic Church, they have a person that's kind of set aside as the head of the church. Of course, that's the Pope. Now, in the Lutheran Church, we don't have a Pope. We have elected officials. We have it's called like a church polity, basically how the government of our church works. So we have a different setup than the Catholics. So that's part of it, is that we're very congregational based, and the Catholic Church is kind of designed like top down. So we don't have a Pope. And then in the Catholic Church, there's something like, the veneration of the saints, and we don't do that. So in the Lutheran Church, we don't pray to the saints. And we have a slightly different take on like communion practices, but honestly, that's about it. We, if I was to say, what's the closest other, Christian faith to what I think the Bible teaches other than Lutheranism, I would say, oh, most definitely Roman Catholic. So, I know all sorts of Catholic folks, and we have a very, very similar faith background and interpretation of Scripture.
What role do Lutherans assign to the Virgin Mary?
So we see the Virgin Mary as, she was blessed by the Lord. I'm trying to remember. I don't have the prayer to Mary. I don't have that memorized. Blessed art thou amongst women, and the fruit of thy womb, Jesus, something like that. So we see Mary as, yes, she's set apart. She is lifted up by God as this kind of example, and this. I guess the word I just keep coming back to is venerated. So she's kind of lifted up as this holy example, and she found favor in God's eyes. But we don't consider her someone that we would pray to, where in the Catholic Church, there are prayers to various saints, most of all being Mary. We don't see Mary as, so she's special, but not as special as perhaps the Catholics see her.
And are women allowed a place in the ministry in the Lutheran Church?
Certainly. That's a great question. Women are allowed in the ministry. They are, we do set aside the role of pastor, so the pastoral role is set aside for men, and we believe that is taught in scriptures. And so in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, you won't see a female pastor, but there are other leadership roles within the church where it's just fine. It's basically just the pastoral office is set aside for men. But, at St. Paul's here in Chicago Heights, the president of the congregation is Pam Meyer. And so, she's a woman. And so she's like basically the administrator of the church. Right. And so, and that, that's all fine and good. And, women are able to help out in church, and they do the readings, and they, help prepare the stuff for communion. And there's also a role that we have, like at seminary. There was some women at seminary with me, classmates, and they study to be what's called a deaconess. And so they have a role where they often go work at schools and hospitals and churches. They don't get up and preach a sermon, but they are involved in all the other roles of service in the church.
What's it like for you to be the pastor of a church?
It's an adventure. Crazy highs and crazy lows, sitting at the bedside of people that are dying, interacting with people with mental illness and people that are really struggling in life, so there are some lows. There are some just kind of some tough situations to deal with. But on the other hand, it's such a joy and a blessing. I mean, getting to do, a baptism, getting to just meet with people in their homes and just have these beautiful experiences of kind of the human spirit, and just getting to know people and work in and around the community. It's a real joy. So honestly, I just consider myself so blessed to be a pastor. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work too, but man, is it a joy.
What do you envision the future of St. Paul in Chicago Heights looking like, since you are the pastor?
That's a great question. I'm not sure what the future holds for Chicago Heights. We're still trying to figure that out. Like I said, I've been here for a year, so still kind of getting my feet wet. And I really think that what I've really been trying to teach and preach and kind of push my congregation on is, hey, let's get involved in the community. Let's figure out Chicago Heights, the neighborhoods that surround our church. Let's figure out what their needs are, and let's see how we can meet those needs. And so that's my hope. We'll see if we can pull it off. It's sometimes that's tough, but we'll see if we can pull it off. Let's get involved in the community. Let's do some acts of service, some acts of kindness, and let's meet the needs of the people in our neighborhood.
Do you find it, is it harder to get people to fill the pews now than in the past?
Well, certainly. My personal experience, when I got to St. Paul's last year, they were worshiping about 65 people on a Sunday. This past 2 months, we've averaged just over 100 people on a Sunday. So in my time here, it's short, it's only been a year, but in my time here, our numbers have grown. That being said, I wasn't here in the past, but if you go back in our records and you look back at the 1950s and 60s, we were worshiping like 1,000 people. And so, yeah, overall, kind of long term, the numbers are down, and the pews, our church could hold 500-600 people. We got a big space, and so even when there's 150 people in there, it still feels a little bit empty. And so one of the goals, I think, of the congregation and for myself is just to bring more people to know Jesus and to get involved in our church, and hopefully that'll lead to people filling the seats. But I think just over time, the neighborhoods have changed, the community's changed, people move around. A lot of my members, they don't actually, so some of my members live in Chicago Heights, but many of them now live further away. They've moved, decades ago, but they still like to drive in because that's the church they grew up in. And so for right now, we're just kind of in this transitionary period where we've really got to engage with the community around us and, talk about what's the future of St. Paul's going to look like. It's going to look different than it did 50 years ago, but that's a good thing. It's going to look different because it's going to look like, hopefully, what the neighborhood looks like. And it's going to be really fun to see that take place these next few years.
Pastor Matt, the last question I would ask my guests is, what are 2 books that you would recommend to the audience that have been important to you, and why?
Okay, that's a great question. I think, other than like the Bible, and obviously, I'm a pastor, so I should probably say, well, of course, the Bible, but that's kind of a given. I think for anyone that's considering ministry or wants to learn more about what it means to be a pastor, a really important book is called The Hammer of God by Bo Geertz. The Hammer of God, and it's just kind of an insight into just some experiences of what it means to be a pastor and, common pitfalls of being a pastor. And hopefully it's, a good, for me, it has been, a book of kind of a cautionary tale and a book of guidance on what it means to be involved in ministry, the highs and the lows. Another one is a book that my church is about to go through, and that is by Tom S. Rainer. It's Autopsy of the Deceased Church. Tom Rainer was this guy who did, he basically would go to churches as a consultant, and he would kind of work with them, and they would say, hey, we need some help because our church is shrinking, man, we really need some help. Where'd everybody go? And so he was this consultant and put together all these books about, here's what I learned, kind of walking congregations through where they were succeeding and where they were failing. And so Autopsy of a Deceased Church is a great book for someone to read who has a heart for the ministry and a heart for church and wants their church to succeed. And it's something that my Sunday morning Bible study, we're going to start going through that in 2 weeks here. And it's basically just going to help us as a congregation kind of look at ourselves and say, what are we doing well? And where are we falling short? And how do we get ourselves on the best possible path so that we can have a bright future?
Pastor Matt Dubensky, thanks for coming on the podcast. If somebody wanted to learn more about you or the church or find you guys on the internet, where would they find you?
So I just built our website just recently, a couple months ago. So we've got a new website. It's stpaulsch.com. St. Paul's with an S, ch.com. You could think St. Paul's, ch for church.com, or St. Paul's, ChicagoHeights.com. So that's our website. And that's got all sorts of information about when we meet for services, kind of our history, our calendar, and just kind of our background, what we believe, stuff like that. But if they wanted to get to know me, I mean, they're welcome to give me a call or shoot me an email, matthewdubensky@gmail.com. They can send me an email. They can call me.
Pastor Matt Dubensky, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Hey, it's not a problem, George. I really appreciate you having me on.
Take care.
Help George stay on the Chicago Heights City Council. Go and donate today at tinyurl.com/AldermanGeorge 2023.
Begin to transform your life and work towards inner peace with expert psychotherapy. At True Heights Treatment, our experienced therapists provide personalized, compassionate care to help you overcome life's challenges and reach your goals. Whether you're struggling with depression, anxiety, relationship issues, or other mental health concerns, our team is here to support you. With a warm and welcoming in-person and virtual office atmosphere and a commitment to person-centered and evidence-based treatments, we are dedicated to helping you address your life's challenges. Contact us now to schedule your first session at 708-248-7039 or online at trueheightstx.com. Book your appointment today and start your journey towards a happier, healthier life.
Need more George? Like his pages on Facebook. Friends of George Brassey PAC, Fifth Ward Business Alliance, Chicago Heights Bicycle and Pedestrian Resource Center, and the George Brassey Podcast.